It's 1919, and though the fighting between the great powers has been over since November, the aftershocks unleashed by the Great War have struck across Central and Eastern Europe. In Germany, the fragile new republic is about to hold its first elections when another round of revolution breaks out, the Spartacist uprising. I'm Jesse Alexander. Welcome to the Great War. We left off in November with the signing of the armistice and the end of the First World War. But it might be more accurate to say we left off with the end of the war that began in 1914. As that war ended 4 years later, it plunged much of Europe and the Middle East into a new period of uncertainty, revolution, and conflict. Germany was rocked by revolution in November 1918. Now, along with pressure from victorious allies, this led to the establishment of a German republic under an interim government. The governing council was a coalition of members of the majority Social Democrats and the independent Social Democrats. And these were the two wings of the Social Democratic Party, which had split during the war. The majority Social Democrats had more or less supported the war effort, and the independent Social Democrats had mostly opposed it. Now, the majority, under the leadership of Philipp Scheidemann and Friedrich Ebert, favored change by reform rather than through revolution. And though they were socialists, they feared a Russian-style revolution and wanted to avoid it at all costs. That's why Ebert made a pact with the new commander of the German army, General Grande, who had taken over from Ludendorff in the last weeks of the war. Now, under this pact, the army agreed to remain loyal to the government, and the government agreed that the old officer class would stay in control of the army. The independents wanted to go further, and they were convinced that only a more radical revolution, giving power to the soldiers and workers' councils, could secure the future for the German working class. And they were very suspicious of the army. Now, this coalition was an unhappy marriage that did not last very long. In the end, the two groups soon fell into a bitter power struggle that escalated on December 25, 1918. A rivalry for influence over the army led to the majority Social Democrat military commander of Berlin to dock the pay of the People's Navy Division, which was a paramilitary policing unit made up of revolutionary sailors in Berlin. Now, these sailors promptly took him prisoner, and Chancellor Ebert ordered in loyal troops. But he did not consult his coalition partners before doing so, and the government troops suffered an embarrassing defeat at what would become known as the Battle of Christmas Day. The independent Social Democrats quit the government and joined with other groups to form the German Communist Party. Now, during the Christmas incident, the Berlin chief of police, a man by the name of Eichhorn, who also happened to be an independent Social Democrat, was so incensed at the government's actions that he sent out the city's security force to help the Navy Division in its fight against army units. Eichhorn thus became a persona non grata in the eyes of the government, which was now under control of the Social Democrats. And they accused him of links to organized crime, connections with Russia, and having Bolshevik sympathies. In the end, on January 5th, he was relieved of his duties. This proved to be too much for many on the left, including the independent Social Democrats, the Communist Party, the Spartacus League, and other groups. Now, the Spartacus League had been founded on the left wing of the Social Democratic Party back in 1916 to oppose the war, and was led by two key figures, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Now, both had been in prison for anti-war activities, but were released at the end of the war. And they were to play a key role in the tragic events that were about to unfold. Now, the opposition, along with a revolutionary group known as the Revolutionäre Obleute Berlin, feared a return to oppressive police practices, as had been the case in Imperial Germany, and called for mass demonstrations against the government that same day, January 5th. Thousands of workers heeded their call and took to the streets to denounce the government's dismissal of the police chief. In the evening, as most of the demonstrators went home, several armed groups occupied a number of newspaper offices, including the headquarters of the Social Democratic newspaper Vorwärts, which means forward in German. And they also occupied a telegraph office. Now the 80-man government garrison of the Vorwärts building gave up without any resistance. And the fact that a newspaper office had an 80-man garrison gives you a good idea about the turbulent situation in Germany at that time. Now throughout the night of the 5th to the 6th January, the revolutionaries discussed what they should do next. Would the masses rise up with them? Would the Berlin garrison and the People's Navy Division join them? Or had the hour finally come, as it had in Russia not so long ago, for a true social revolution to take place? They convinced themselves that they had a chance and it was worth the risk to go for it all. A revolutionary committee was formed under the leadership of Liebknecht and 2 others, and they put out a call for the overthrow of the government. Now, this begs the question, why would they do this? Because just the day before, the Communist Party of Germany had come out against the Second Revolution. Second Revolution meaning after the November Revolution. There had been no concrete plan for a revolution on that day in January either. One explanation is that rumors paired with hopeful ideology led them to take the fateful decision for a revolution. And the fact is, they didn't have much concrete information and were forced to base a lot of their decisions on rumors of all different sorts. Like, they couldn't know that the stories of army units ready to defect or that the Navy division was rushing to support them were just not true. And the size of the crowds at the demonstration earlier that day fed their hopes and dreams of a mass uprising. Now clearly, occupying a few buildings in Berlin was not a winning tactic, and actually it made them sitting ducks for government troops and paramilitary forces. But they believed that even if the circumstances didn't favor them, it seemed that the moment for the inevitable revolution of the workers might have arrived. So in the end, a demonstration over the firing of a police chief had become an improvised revolution. Now the following day, a sort of a standoff set in. There were competing revolutionary and pro-government demonstrations that took place in the city, where the crowds were whipped up with all sorts of different heated rhetoric. Government speakers brandished the specter of a Russian-style catastrophe in Germany and warned of imminent violence. A call was put out to demobilizing soldiers in ghastly terms. More blood must be spilled. Soldiers who have done your duty on the battlefield, consider it now your duty to ensure order returns to Berlin, that we might have peace. In addition, women were told to stay at home. Now for his part, Liebknecht tried to fire up the crowd and announced that the moment for the revolution had come. He even invited soldiers to join the revolutionaries, stating, "Our weapons are at our side." Now at some point that day, January 6th, the first shots were exchanged between the revolutionaries and government forces. It's not clear who fired first. But by the end of the day, it did become clear to the revolutionaries that the masses were not going to rise up with them. The streets emptied that evening, except for the government troops. Now, Liebknecht's plea to the People's Navy Division fell on deaf ears, and most of the Spartacists were ready to negotiate at that point because they'd realized that their cause was lost. But there was no de-escalation possible anymore, as it happened at the Christmas incident. The government figures had made up their minds to crush the uprising. They issued a statement on January 8th. "Violence can only be fought with violence. The organized violence of the people will put an end to the repression and anarchy. Isolated successes of the enemies of freedom, which they have laughably exaggerated, are only of temporary significance. The hour of reckoning draws near." Now, paramilitary groups of former soldiers, known as Freikorps, answered the government call and began to march on the city. But who exactly were the Freikorps? Well, they were loosely organized groups of a mix of frontline veteran soldiers and young students and officer cadets who hadn't fought in the war at all. Now, these men were not really united by a cohesive ideology, but they hated the revolution that had turned Germany into a republic and bitterly resented the humiliation of a defeat that they just couldn't accept. They burned for revenge and eagerly adopted the myth of the stab in the back. That is to say that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefields of World War I, but had been betrayed by Jews and leftists on the home front. They also opposed the new position of women in society and they glorified violence, hierarchy, and order because they were searching for meaning in the chaotic post-war world. Now, the government's call to arms gave them what amounted to a state-sanctioned license to kill and release their pent-up rage. In the end, these were the men on whom the government would rely to crush the Spartacists. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, why did the government decide on this particular course of action? The rebels clearly had no chance, but the increasing polarization had gone too far. German newspapers egged on the government, calling for blood. And in a troubling echo of the war years, some in the government circles felt that a violent suppression of the doomed uprising would have a quote-unquote healing effect on the troubled nation. They also wanted to show the world that Germany was not Russia, and in spite of its weakened state, there would be no Russian-style revolution there, which was their greatest fear. They wanted revenge against the far left as well, since their social democratic counterparts in Russia had been defeated by Lenin's Bolsheviks. In addition, they hoped to show the Entente powers that they were still in control. They also felt the need to safeguard the upcoming elections, which had been scheduled for January 19th. Now, the independent socialists did try to negotiate, but the government refused. While the center and right-wing press called for blood, the independent socialist paper The Freiheit, Freedom, wrote bitterly, "The spirit and the language of August 1914 are alive again. But this time, they're not directed against the British, French, and Russians, but against the revolutionary workers." Rosa Luxemburg, though she was not present for the creation of the Revolutionary Committee, continued to call for revolution in the Rote Fahne, the newspaper of the Spartacus League. This is a bit puzzling for historians, since just days before, she'd helped to craft the German Communist Party platform, which emphasized taking power, but with the support of the people, rather than by a coup. On the morning of January 11th, the government finally made its move. Freikorps soldiers under the command of former imperial officer Franz von Stefani began an attack on the main building occupied by the Spartacists, the Vorwärts offices. Now, their tactics were based on those of the Western Front of 1918 that they knew so well. First, artillery fire collapsed several walls of the building. Then, they launched a small-scale stormtrooper attack, but this was beaten back by the defenders. One machine gun in particular held up the government advance, and the rumor soon spread that Rosa Luxemburg herself was operating it. But this was not true, as she was not even present. Further attacks proved to be successful, and the Freikorps took the front part of the building. Now, at this point, the defenders realized their situation was hopeless and sent out a party of 5 men under a white flag to negotiate an end to the siege. These men were promptly made prisoner and taken to a nearby army barracks. Now, by the time they arrived, they'd already been severely beaten, and once inside, they were murdered, along with 2 others who'd been taken prisoner earlier. And the group of soldiers in the building's courtyard then shot the men again and again, even after they'd been killed. Now, the siege soon came to an end, and some 200 to 300 Spartacists, including around 20 women and Karl Liebknecht's own teenage son Willi, surrendered. Many local residents cheered the soldiers as they marched the revolutionaries to the nearby army barracks. Once there, one of the female prisoners was mistaken for Rosa Luxemburg and was then beaten by the captors. Only the intervention of the social democratic editor of the newspaper, who had witnessed the entire morning's events from close up, prevented her from being shot. Now, the holdouts in the other buildings around the city were rapidly rounded up, and the Spartacist uprising was over. Now, later that afternoon, the minister responsible for the armed forces, Gustav Noske, led several thousand troops in a victory parade through the city. The newspapers, other than those on the far left, celebrated the event. The government put out a statement congratulating itself. "The brave troops of the Republic put down a revolt that threatened to destroy all the hard-won freedoms of the revolution." Now, the statement failed to mention that most of the Republic's soldiers were in fact Freikorps volunteers, and it went on to accuse the Spartacus League of siding with dark elements in Berlin and cooperating with a foreign power, by which they meant Bolshevik Russia, to seize power from the nation. Now, these allegations of Russian connections were simply not true. Of the 400 Spartacists that were captured, only about 20 were not German, and only a handful of these turned out to be Russian. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, the two most prominent figures among the revolutionaries, soon went into hiding. But incentivized through a hefty bounty, a neighborhood militia found them and alerted the Freikorps unit Marine Escadron Flug. Now this was not a typical Freikorps organization, since it was actually secretly attached to an elite regular army unit, the Gada Cavalry Schützendivision. Now the men in this unit were mostly ex-sailors and were hankering for some action that they hadn't been able to get during the uneventful war years that they spent idly waiting in harbor. Now the Freikorpsmen stormed the building and took Luxemburg and Liebknecht prisoner. They were then brought to the nearby Hotel Eden, near the Schützendivision barracks, and handed over to a notoriously anti-Bolshevik officer of the regular army by the name of Waldemar Pabst. Now Pabst is likely the one who ended up giving the order to have them killed. But in the end, each was taken out in turn to the hotel lobby, which was filled with officers and hotel guests. As they passed through the lobby, several soldiers beat them, including with the butts of their rifles. Liebknecht was taken to a nearby park and shot 3 times at close range. And a little later on, Luxemburg, who may have already been dead from a rifle butt to the head that she received in the hotel, was loaded onto a car. As the car drove away, an officer rushed up and shot her in the head. Her body was then dumped in a nearby canal and was only found several weeks later. Now, it has not been proven conclusively who instructed Pabst to have the two killed. Pabst himself would much later write that Social Democratic Minister Gustav Noske let it be understood that it wouldn't be a bad thing if the executions were to take place. In any case, the idea of murdering them was not necessarily new, as since December, various right-wing groups had placed pamphlets around the city calling for the death of Liebknecht, leftists, and Jews generally. The government refused to put a stop to the pamphleteering, though, on the grounds of free speech. Now, after the murders, the press and the government did not really express much regret about what happened. Scheidemann, who would become the country's first democratically elected leader in a few days, blamed Liebknecht and Luxemburg for their own fate, saying they themselves were the victims of their own act of terror. The Reichsbote newspaper even made the claim that Liebknecht's death meant many innocent people will remain alive, and the Tägliche Rundschau concluded that Luxemburg's death was cruel but just. Now, after the fact, no independent trial of the perpetrators ever took place. The government even allowed the very unit involved, the Gada Cavalry Schützendivision, to conduct an internal court-martial. So those in positions of command were never accused, and only 2 soldiers ended up receiving light sentences. One served 2 years in detention in Holland, and the other was given fake papers by the very judge who'd presided over his trial, Wilhelm Canaris, and then he was allowed to leave the country after just 3 days in prison. Though the January uprising never really represented an actual threat to topple the government, it was nonetheless a tipping point for the young Weimar Republic. No one was ever punished for the murders at the barracks or for the murders of Luxemburg and Liebknecht. Instead, the government praised and protected those who were involved. The Spartacists were given all the blame for the violence, and little consideration was given to the consequences of military-style violence being used in such a way. On the contrary, the Social Democrats, conservatives, and nationalists had now found common ground, that violence in the name of government was justified and was not to be questioned. The controversial pact between Chancellor Ebert and General Groener had, in the words of Mark Jones, been sealed in blood. For Germany, this was not the last spasm of post-war revolution to come in 1919, for even deadlier days lay ahead. And now the events in Germany in January 1919 were by no means unique. In the territories of every defeated state, and of course in Russia as well, the old order had simply broken down. The situation has been described as an arc of post-war violence that stretched from Finland and the Baltic states through Russia and Ukraine, Poland, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and all the way through the Balkans into Anatolia, the Caucasus, and the Middle East. Along that arc, social revolutions, national revolutions, paramilitary violence, and border wars between the new nations were the order of the day, and would eventually cost about 4 million lives. Here's a sampling of what was going on in January 1919. On the 7th, the Christmas uprising, so called because Orthodox Christmas takes place in early January, reached its peak in Montenegro. The Greens, who resisted the idea of unconditional unification with Yugoslavia, preferring a confederation, were defeated by troops loyal to the new kingdom. On the 9th, Polish rebels captured the German airport just outside the city of Posen, as Poles sought, in their eyes, to reclaim areas of eastern Germany or western Poland for the new Polish state. On January 21st, in Ireland, 2 policemen were killed in the Soloheadbeg ambush, which marked the start of the Anglo-Irish War. The very same day, members of the party favouring Irish independence, Sinn Féin, formed a revolutionary parliament and declared an Irish republic. Just 2 days later, on the 23rd, fighting broke out between Czech and Polish forces over the coal-rich and ethnically mixed region of Teschen. Both sides sent troops to the area, hoping to claim it before the peace conference in Paris could intervene. The Czech forces advanced until pressure from the Entente powers put a stop to the fighting. And 4 days after that, German-speaking residents of the town of Marburg, and just to avoid confusion, that's today's Maribor in Slovenia, organized a protest in favor of the town joining the new Austrian Republic. The crowd was fired upon by soldiers of the new Yugoslav army, and around a dozen people were killed in what would become known as Marburg's Bloody Sunday. The incident led to an offensive by Austrian troops to reclaim territory north of the town, which had previously been occupied by Yugoslav troops after the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You still with me? Now, throughout the entire month, fighting raged across the former Russian Empire. Not only was there a civil war between the Bolsheviks and the Whites, but numerous wars with parts of the empire which had declared their independence as well. Starting on January 22nd, Red Army forces advanced on Kiev. They pushed back troops loyal to the new independent Ukrainian People's Republic and captured the town on February 5th. On the Eastern Front, that is to say the Eastern Front of the Russian Civil War, near the Siberian town of Perm, a Bolshevik counteroffensive to recapture the city was stopped by a White Army under the command of Admiral Kolchak. In the north, the Red Army attacked Allied troops which had been sent in 1918 to intervene on the side of the Whites in the Civil War. Now, the Reds advanced against a combined force of American, British, Canadian, and White Russian troops and pushed them out of the Arctic town of Shenkursk, which prevented any attempt at linking up with larger White forces to the southeast. To the south, the Bolsheviks defeated the White Russian Army of the Don near the city of Voronezh. Meanwhile, in the Baltic, Finnish and Estonian troops defeated the Red Army in several small battles throughout the month, in what would become the Estonian War of Independence. But aside from revolutions, revolts, and various upheavals, there was another massive transition facing every former belligerent state once the war, the Great Power War at least, was over: demobilization. Now, at war's end in 1918, tens of millions of men were still under arms, and though the vast majority were relieved that the slaughter was over, their thoughts soon turned to going home. Getting them there would prove to be a massive undertaking. Undoing the armies of 1918 involved an unprecedented movement of people and material, and was a much bigger job than simply letting the soldiers go home. Now, those same men who had been away from home and exposed to the horrors of war now had to be somehow reintegrated into the economy and society, which would prove to be no easy task. One of the first questions was to decide who got to go home first. Some countries, like France and Italy, chose to demobilize soldiers based on age. This had the benefit of being egalitarian, as it often corresponded to the length of service. But it was also difficult to put into practice, since it meant that constantly shrinking units had to be reorganized. The British, on the other hand, chose to prioritize economic interests, and they allowed men in high-demand jobs to return home first. The Americans, for their part, reduced their forces unit by unit, which allowed the army to retain more cohesiveness. Now, given the scale of the operation, this would all take time. For example, France's 5 million man army was only fully demobilized by 1920. And though the Western powers' demobilization was relatively orderly, it was not without a certain amount of tension. For example, 5,000 British troops mutinied in January after hearing that they were going to be sent to France, and Canadian troops, frustrated at the delays, rioted in March. 5 soldiers were even killed in that incident. Now, the defeated armies of the Central Powers had a much more chaotic situation on their hands. Many soldiers simply demobilized themselves if they could, hitching rides or simply walking home. As the German army marched back across the Rhine, for example, about 500,000 men fell out of the line and made for home. The new German Republic feared the consequences of a rapid or uncontrolled demobilization, as that would see millions of men flood the labor market and lead to unrest. But Allied pressure for a quick dissolution of the Kaiser's army and self-demobilization meant that the entire process took only 2 months and was formally complete by January 1919, although we just have seen how these men were able to take up arms again. One group that faced a particularly difficult challenge were prisoners of war. Often, there were long delays before they were able to return home, especially for prisoners of the former Central Powers. In the East, some were released by the Bolsheviks soon after the revolution, but hundreds of thousands of Germans and former Austro-Hungarian subjects were stranded behind the lines of the Russian Civil War. Many of them were swept up in the violence, and they ended up fighting on both sides. Not until 1922 did the last of them reach home. Now in the West, the November 11th armistice terms called for the release of French and British prisoners immediately, but forbade the release of German prisoners until the end of peace negotiations. They were only allowed to return late in 1919 and even early in 1920, after the Treaty of Versailles had already been signed. This despite protests from German civil society groups and pressure from the papacy. In the meantime, they were put to work rebuilding areas destroyed by the fighting. Even more difficult than breaking up the armies would be putting the pieces back together in civilian society. It was one thing to give a man civilian clothes and some pocket money with the promise of a pension, but another thing to help him live a normal life after years of trauma. Now, governments did try to put some measures in place to make it easier for veterans to find jobs. Germany massively expanded the civil service, and there was a French law that required employers to give returned soldiers their old jobs back, although this didn't always happen in practice. And both in Britain and France, there were public campaigns to encourage women to leave their wartime jobs and return home or to take up women's work, which would free up space for men. Many of the returned men were also wounded, in body or in mind, and faced challenges taking up meaningful work. Some were bitter at the society to which they returned, since their pensions were often inadequate, and relatives, wives, and others simply couldn't relate to what they'd been through. Whether they found work or not, many veterans still struggled in their post-war lives. In fact, one estimate puts the rate of psychological trauma at about 25%, and divorce rates in France and also in Germany spiked ominously after the war. Now, these difficulties could be more intense for former prisoners, who were often treated differently by their governments and also by their fellow citizens. In some countries, like France and Italy, they were denied equal pension benefits and military decorations until years later. Italy even classified former POWs as non-combatants, and the poet and right-wing nationalist Gabriele D'Annunzio derisively referred to them as the shirkers across the Alps. The guilt of having been taken captive haunted many for years after their release. A French prisoner of war wrote to a friend, "The immense joy I feel about current events, the end of the war, is mixed with indescribably bitter regret at not having played a better part in the war. Not having been able to participate in this victory, weapon in hand, will be a source of grief that will only expire with my life." That soldier's name was Charles de Gaulle. For he and many of those who had lived through it, the Great War was not over. Just weeks after the armistice, it had already become clear that the war to end all wars did not even come close to achieving that goal. Here's a fitting quote from a Freikorps member, Friedrich Wilhelm Heinz, from 1930, that sums up the situation well. "When they told us the war was over, we laughed, because we were the war. Its flame continued to burn in us. It lived on in our deeds, surrounded by a glowing and frightful aura of destruction. We followed our inner calling and marched on the battlefields of the post-war period." That was our first new episode of The Great War 1919. Here we'll continue to deliver an in-depth look at history 100 years ago, as we did before. Usually we're going to pick a main topic, like the German Revolution in this episode, but we'll also talk about all the other relevant events and ideas. As a rule of thumb, we'll upload new content every other week. And if you're curious about me, the new guy, you'll be able to get to know me a bit better soon here on the channel. Now, two of my main sources for this episode were Robert Gerwarth's The Vanquished and Mark Jones's Founding Weimar. You can find all our sources for this episode in the video description, including links to Amazon. And if you buy through these links, we do get a small cut, whether you use the US or other international Amazon sites. The Great War 1919 is a production of Real Time History, Flo and Tony's new production company. You see, Flo and Tony produced The Great War already from 2014 to 2018. And if you want to support our revamped channel, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Among other things, Patreon supporters will get access to our relaunched Great War podcast. On the podcast, Flo and I will talk more about the topics of the month and give you some sneak peeks behind the scenes of the show. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War, the only YouTube history channel that knows where to get the most revolutionary currywurst in Berlin.